This is a true incident from my life, and though I've changed a few names for privacy, every beat you're about to hear happened to me exactly as I remember it. I'm telling it now because the quiet pieces of revenge only make sense when you know how loud the humiliation sounded first. "You'll never be rich," my husband said the night he signed the papers that emptied my IRA. And 2 years later, I stood inside the Chase Bank vault at State and Madison in downtown Chicago, watching the assistant manager turn a brass wheel and punch in a 6-digit code he didn't realize was my birthday. The door breathed open with a sigh, the air cold and metallic, and my lawyer, Leah, squeezed my wrist as the banker slid out the long steel drawer with the number I'd memorized. We were gathered there because we'd secured a court order for the contents, his safe deposit box, after months of breadcrumbing our way through his lies. When the lid clacked up and the banker stepped back, I smelled old paper and the oil of a gun I'd never seen before in my life. And I realized the only way he ever thought he could keep me poor was to keep me blind. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I was 58 when I met Eric. I had a little flower shop on Lincoln Avenue in Lincoln Square, in the brick row a block from the chopping block and Café Selmery, where the window boxes looked better in fall, because I knew how to make chrysanthemums behave. My kids were grown and out, my son in Madison, my daughter in Denver, and my days had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Bed sheets that smelled like lavender, early deliveries to condos along Lakeshore Drive, and an evening glass of Pinot at Jean's rooftop. I had outlived a marriage 30 years long, not angrily, just worn smooth by time and separate dreams. Money was never dramatic. Modest savings, a paid-off bungalow, the store that paid its bills and mine. I didn't crave rich, I craved room. Eric breezed into the shop on a March afternoon because his assistant had botched an order for a Lakeview donor dinner, and he needed 22 centerpieces by 6 p.m. He wore a navy suit that fit like a hand, a coat draped over his arm, and he talked with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. "You're Nora," he said, reading the name on the receipt spike. "I've been told you're a miracle worker." Flattery is just a lighter word for attention, and he used both. I liked the way he asked questions about peonies and listened, the way he rolled up his sleeves and carried crates like he knew he wasn't above it. He insisted on paying in full and tipping like we were waitstaff. And when he returned the next morning with coffee from the Wormhole in Wicker Park, too far to be casual, I knew I had a man who wanted to be seen. We became we, embarrassingly fast for a woman who knew better. He took me to Girl and the Goat and didn't push the small plates across the table as if I were auditioning for them. He booked a room at the Palmer House the night of my birthday so I could dress up and pretend my city was new. He said he did opportunity development for small tech firms, warm words that promised heat, and he had contacts at 1871 in the Merchandise Mart, at M-Hub, at a co-working space in the West Loop I'd never heard of. His phone lit up with names he didn't hide. When the snow thawed, he brought me to the 606 for a long walk and told me he admired small business owners more than anyone because they put their names on their windows and their hearts on the line. "You're a builder," he said, kissing my hair at Levitt Street as the sun went down. People like us deserve to be rich. The first humiliation lived in a place you would only find if you knew the map of me. A month after we married at City Hall, we had dinner at Gibson's on Rush with a table of Eric's friends and investors. I wore a navy wrap dress that made me feel elegant and safe. The men traded stories about closings and seed rounds, women's names woven in like garnish. I wasn't intimidated until one of them asked me what it was like to run a cute little shop. And I smiled and explained margins and wedding seasons and refrigeration repair like a pro. Then Eric put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Babe, you're brilliant, but we both know you'll never be rich arranging daisies." The table laughed like it was a toast, and I watched the waiter's face, a man who'd been taught to laugh with his eyes shut, because the humiliation needed a witness. "It was a joke," he said later, and I was being sensitive. I slept facing the wall. The next morning, he sent a dozen roses to the shop with a card that read, "Only one woman has the roots to grow me." The cheap thought clothed in expensive words. He nudged me, over months, into aligning our finances. It sounded like yoga for money. My bungalow had equity. His opportunities had timelines. My IRA sat there like a bird on a branch. "I can triple it in a year," he told me, sliding an iPad across our kitchen island with charts and names and a deck so shiny I could see my doubt reflected in it. We went to my bank, Chase, on Lawrence, and he charmed the manager like he'd charmed me. We consolidated accounts for simplification, and then, one day, rain on the windows, I came home to a stack of documents with little flags where my initials should go. He had arranged for a line of credit secured by the property, and he needed me to sign because the bank wanted a co-borrower. He poured wine and said, "You trust me, right?" The wind shifted the maple outside. I was old enough to know the difference between caution and fear. I was also old enough to know I was tired of doing hard things alone. I signed. "If this goes bad," I asked, "do we lose the house?" He grinned and kissed my forehead like I'd cracked a joke. "I'm not a gambler," he said. "I make bets with loaded dice." Small signs stuttered through spring. A Saturday where he was suddenly out of pocket and came home smelling like a cologne I didn't recognize, not perfume, cologne, and the distinction felt important. An ACH withdrawal with a label I didn't know. Monroe Harbor Holdings, LLC, 9:42 a.m., $18,400. Another for $42,000. I asked, and he waved one hand. "Pass-through vehicles," he said. "Tax stuff. Boring." I wasn't bored. I used to do the books for my shop, squinting at QuickBooks reports while my assistant sprayed the cooler room and the peonies groaned open. I knew the rhythm of money when it was honest. This had a different time signature. I found the first paper clue because I was doing laundry. People underestimate how many ruins are excavated near washing machines. It was a thin slip, folded in half and coffee-stained at the corner from Bank of America on LaSalle. "SDB access, Whitman, Eric," it read, with a date and time and a note. "ID verified." I tucked it back into the pocket of a suit I'd just started to forgive. He had never mentioned a safe deposit box. I tried to tell myself it could be anything. Old watch, family papers, the gun he pretended he didn't own when we watched the news. I don't know if suspicion feels different when you're older. For me, it felt like finally respecting my own pattern recognition. I didn't snoop. I investigated. The next morning, I brewed coffee at 6 a.m. and drove to the Harold Washington Library, 4th floor, where the computers run fast because students treat them like track meets. I searched the Illinois Secretary of State's database for Monroe Harbor Holdings, LLC, and found a registered agent, a P.O. box, and an address that wasn't a building, so much as a concept. One of those mailbox stores on Clark Street that sells every shipping company at once. I looked up the UCC filings and felt nausea wash over me when I saw my name. He'd used the house as collateral to secure a line of credit tied to his opportunities, and my signature, my actual signature, looked like a child had forged it. I compared it to the one on my driver's license. I could see where the pen had hesitated, a tremor at the bottom of the R. He had signed for me. Not on the house, he'd had that, but elsewhere, on a guarantee I never agreed to. That night, I rehearsed how I would ask. Then I didn't ask. I made lasagna and kept my mouth shut because fear burns calories. Eric's power didn't live in his money, so much as the way he made other people believe in his money. He had a Tesla he leased like a costume. He knew the bartenders at the Berkshire Room and sent bottles that weren't on the menu. He could flatter a doorman and get 2 parking tickets voided, with a joke and a wink. He wore an Apple Watch, but kept a vintage GMT Master in a velvet pouch in his desk, like a promise. I watched people relax in the gravity of his confidence, and I tried to remember the last time someone looked at me that way, because I had flowers and stubbornness, not capital. He introduced me to a man named Grayson at Soho House who called me darling and told me my husband had vision. Another named Willow. She wore a white blazer and a mouth like a straight razor. Pitched me on a friends and family tranche, a word that turns family into money and friends into fees. They dressed it all in terms like term sheet and cap table and waterfall, words that could drown you. The turning point came in the least cinematic place, the loading dock behind my shop, a Tuesday, drizzle like a shrugged shoulder. I was accepting a shipment of freesia and lilies when my phone rang with a Cook County number. The voice was polite but bureaucratic. Ms. Sinclair-Whitman, we're calling to confirm your appearance next Thursday at the Daily Center, room 2006, regarding case number. I lost the number and heard only the hum of my own blood. A hearing I didn't know about. Eric had never mentioned any court date. My hands trembled so hard I nearly dropped the scanner. I'm sorry, I said. I think you have the wrong person. The clerk read my address, my name, my birth date. After I hung up, I sat on an upturned milk crate and breathed in the smell of crushed stems and forget-me-not dirt. And I understood something ugly. If my name was on a court docket attached to a company I had never seen, then whatever was locked in that box on LaSalle wasn't a watch. The next step required humility I didn't like. I asked for help. My niece's friend Leah had just joined a mid-size firm with a view of the river and furniture too modern to sit on. She met me at Beatrix in River North and listened in the way lawyers do, nodding only when it wouldn't interrupt the story. She asked for the paper trail. I had started to gather one. The ACH printouts, the UCC filings, a copy of my signature that looked like my own name in somebody else's hand. She asked if I could get any mail from Monroe Harbor Holdings. I could not. She asked about a safe deposit box. I told her about the slip I found in his pants and the metal taste in my mouth when I thought about it. We can subpoena, she said, but it's hard without a broader matter. However, she stirred her coffee and looked at me with a practical tenderness. In Illinois, spouses have certain rights regarding marital property, even informational rights. If we can demonstrate good cause and potential harm, we might get a court to order the bank to preserve the box contents and provide access pending our appearance. Worst case, we put them on notice they shouldn't let him empty it. The court date you got called about? That might be our lever. I spent the week living on lists. I closed the shop early and sat in the back office and traced the money with a ruler and a pen. I called my mortgage company and learned there had been a routine inquiry from a private lender I'd never heard of. I called my son in Madison and lied about a sinus infection because my voice wanted to break. I cooked every meal like a ritual, chopping onions small, waiting for them to go translucent, and told myself that a woman who can make risotto patient is a woman who can survive paperwork. Eric came home later and later, easing into bed like a whisper that hadn't learned it wasn't welcome. He could tell something had shifted. He bought me a cashmere shawl and tickets to the lyric opera, and the questions he didn't want asked. He kissed my neck and said, "We're almost there," the way gamblers tell the felt what to do. The hearing at the Daily Center smelled like elevator oil and raincoats. The clerk's bench was efficient and unforgiving. My name was on the docket as a guarantor for a short-term bridge loan to Monroe Harbor Holdings. Eric represented himself with a smile that had gotten him through many doors, perhaps too many. A man from the lender wore a suit so black it bent light. Leah sat with me, a thin folder in her lap, filled with the things I had printed late at night, when the house felt too quiet. When our matter was called, Eric stood and touched my shoulder like I was a prop and said, "Your Honor, my wife is—" "X," Leah said softly, but the judge held up a finger. "Let her speak," he said. I did. I said I had not signed any guarantee to any loan. I said my signature on the UCC looked like a Xerox could tell it was wrong. I said I had reason to believe there were assets being concealed in a safe deposit box. Leah referenced the statute, and the judge's eyes warmed a degree. He issued an order preserving the contents of any box in Eric's name, pending further review, and granted limited access to me and my counsel to inventory its contents in the presence of bank staff. He scheduled a follow-up in 10 days. I felt the ground under me return like a floor in an elevator that had dropped too fast. I didn't tell Eric we were going to the bank. I went home with Leah, and we sat at my kitchen table while I pulled out the folder of receipts and dates. "Tell me something he doesn't know you know," she said. I flipped through and paused at a yellow Post-it that had fallen out of his planner weeks ago. Or 92369. It was nonsense to me until it wasn't. Or 92369, my birthday. He had written it down somewhere and lost it, and I'd thrown the Post-it into the folder because it made me angry that my life could be compressed into 6 digits. I stared at it in Leah's hand and felt heat rise in my cheeks. "If that's the box code," she said quietly, "be ready for whatever's on the other side." The morning we went to Chase at State and Madison. The sky over the loop was pewter, and the sidewalks were a lacquer of last night's rain. The assistant manager, a woman with careful bangs named Rita, led us through the locked door and into the steel-ribbed room where privacy is louder than noise. She asked for IDs and the court order and apologized because she had to do it by the book. "There are a lot of books," I said, and she smiled without her eyes. She reached up and turned a wheel the size of a dinner plate, and then stopped at a keypad and looked at me. "Do you know the code?" she asked. I nodded. I typed my birthday, the one detail he never bothered to learn except to use. The keypad chirped, and the wheel gave. She slid out the drawer and set it on the waist-high table. My throat was dry enough to spark. The lid lifted. There was cash, stacks strapped with rubber bands, 2 thin folders, a black semi-automatic I didn't know the name of, and a spiral-bound notebook with a craft cover stained at the corner. Leah put on gloves. I didn't breathe. "Let's count," she said softly. Rita nodded and started making a list. 50,000, 100, 200. A small mountain of money that made my mortgage look like a traffic ticket. In the folder, photocopies of my signature on documents I'd never seen. In the notebook, a ledger of investments that were just arrows from my accounts to his. In the second folder, photographs of me, of my shop, of my house. Taken at times, I didn't know he was watching. "This isn't just about money," Leah whispered. "This is about control." I felt the room tilt like a ship. That's when she held up a receipt dated the previous week. A cash withdrawal, $20,000, and a scrawl at the bottom, G to W, keep cool. I recognized G, Grayson, the man at Soho House, whose smile felt like a dare. Leah slid the photocopies into our folder and nodded to Rita to close the box for now. "We have enough to move," she said, and the way she said move made me feel like maybe I had never been stuck. By the time we stepped back into the loop, the clouds had torn and the blinds were open on the high floors. I thought about how he loved altitude, rooftops and penthouses and perspectives that turned people into toy cars, and how angry gravity must make men like that, how much they spend to pretend they're above it. I put the court order in my bag and my hands didn't shake. I walked past the sculpture in Calder Plaza and told myself I could find the red line I had once drawn in kindergarten and make it real again. Then my phone buzzed. "Eric." A text. "Did you have a nice morning?" I stared at the screen and wondered whether he'd noticed the wheel turn in some universe of his vanity, where he could feel the room change when he wasn't in it. I typed and erased, typed and erased. I chose silence because sometimes revenge begins with refusing to narrate your progress for the person who deserves to be. Surprised? I put the phone down and told Leah I wanted to make a withdrawal. Not money, but something else I had left too long in someone else's care. Her eyebrows reached for her hairline. "What?" she asked. "My dignity," I said, and she laughed in a way that made me feel stronger. And then, like a bad coin I thought I had spent, I saw Eric's car glide to the curb. He stepped out, that navy suit, that easy grin, and called my name as if downtown were his foyer and I were home. I didn't run. I didn't greet him. I didn't pretend anything. I watched him cross the sidewalk toward me, and for the first time since the man in the Rolex asked me about daisies at Gibson's, I felt the exact weight of what I was willing to carry and what I was ready to put down, because the box had been opened, and what spilled out wasn't just his secrets. It was the blueprint for taking back everything he had taken from me, and more. He lifted his hand like a man hailing a cab and said, "Babe, we need to talk." And behind him, like a curtain pulling back, I saw the face of someone I hadn't expected to see again. Grayson, standing in the doorway of a coffee shop across the street, looking surprised to find me upright and unafraid. That's when I understood the next move wasn't in a vault or a courtroom. It was on the street, where they thought no one could take their power away. I was 60 years old, and suddenly I wasn't afraid of their altitude anymore. I wanted them on the ground with me, and I knew exactly how to make them fall. He reached for me like I'd wandered from his orbit, and he could tug me back with gravity alone. "Babe," Eric said, low and careful, like he was soothing a horse. "Don't do anything stupid." The smile he saved for waitstaff hovered just behind his teeth. Across Clark, Grayson lifted a to-go cup and tried to look like a passerby. I thought of the notebook in the box, of the neat arrows he'd drawn from my accounts to his, of the copies of my name trained to walk like mine. I thought of the way he had told a table at Gibson's I'd never be rich, and how their laughter had rung like glassware. "I already did something stupid," I said, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder so I could feel the weight of the court order against my ribs. "I married you." His smile pinched. He glanced at Leah and recalculated. "You're overreacting," he said, dropping his voice. "There are moving parts here you don't understand." Leah looked past him to Grayson and lifted a hand just enough to make him flinch, like a man expecting a flash. "Ms. Sinclair-Whitman understands enough," she said, "and the court understands the rest." He lowered his voice further, as if volume could make lies behave. "We could fix this if you stop with the theatrics." "The only theatrics I see," I said, "is you showing up to the bank you pretend you don't have." Yeah, turned and walked, not because I thought he'd follow, but because I wanted him to. He did, pacing at my shoulder, the clipped rhythm of a man late to his own alibi. When I reached the corner, I stopped with my back to the Calder Flamingo and faced him fully for the first time in months. "I'm done guessing what you've done," I said. "I'm telling you what happens next. You're not going to open that box. You're not going to touch my house, and you're not going to use my name ever again." He laughed like he'd been given a script with the wrong ending. "What box?" he said, too bright. "What house? Why are you being hysterical?" "I opened the box," I said, "with a code you wrote down on a Post-it and forgot. 6 numbers you didn't bother to learn except to use." His face stilled so suddenly I could feel the air harden between us. "You don't get to tell me I'll never be rich and then store my life in a drawer." He glanced at Leah again and turned the wattage back on. "We're obviously going to litigate this," he said to her, as if I were a piece of evidence. "But if she thinks she can—" "She doesn't think," Leah said, too softly for anyone else to hear. "She knows." I left him mid-sentence because the point wasn't to win an argument on the pavement. It was to win the war, slow, methodical, and impossible to spin. The next days moved like chess. Leah filed an emergency motion at the Daily Center to freeze marital assets and enjoin Eric from accessing any safe deposit boxes or moving funds in accounts connected to Monroe Harbor Holdings, Whitman & Co., or any pass-through shell with a Clark Street mailbox for a heart. The judge we'd drawn at random liked paper. Leah made him a snowstorm. We attached the ledger photos, the photocopied signatures, the bank's inventory of the box. She included my notarized affidavit describing how I'd discovered my forged guarantee and the clerk's phone call that had rolled my stomach like a wave. We served Eric at our bungalow that night at 9:17. I watched from my car, a house away, while the process server, short, fast, forgettable, handed the envelope to the man who loved altitude. I watched him stand in the yellow light of our porch and flip through the pages like they could be rearranged into the outcome he wanted, And when he reached the part that mentioned the gun inventory, he looked up into the dark and scanned the block like the street might answer his question. The lights in Mrs. Kavanaugh's living room next door threw lace shadows on his suit. He looked smaller from a distance. I changed the locks. I changed the online banking passwords and codes that were mine. I moved the shop's operating account to a different bank, and in the memo line of the cashier's check, I wrote, "Flowers are stubborn." I called a locksmith for the back door of the shop because the man had a way of appearing where convenience lived. I told my employees, Sweet Maya and Sharp Nick, that if anyone, even me, asked for after-hours access without texting first, they were to call the police. "But you'd text," Maya said. "Exactly," I said. Grayson emerged from the side, like comic relief that didn't make anybody laugh. He texted me 2 days later, as if we were old friends who traded recipes. "We should talk. Coffee at La Colombe? On Erie?" I screenshotted it and sent it to Leah. "We'll talk," she replied, "just not the way he thinks." She reached out to a contact in the Illinois Securities Department, the part of the Secretary of State's office that polices unregistered offerings, the people you never think about until your savings disappear into a hole with a slick deck and a champagne reception. The investigator's name was Rangel. He wore his hair like a decision and listened like a metronome. We met him in a bland conference room on Randolph with views of rooftops that were trying hard to be terraces. Leah laid out the ledger, the flow, the friends and family, hustle-brined in luxury vodka branding. He was careful with his words. If he solicited without registering, if he made misrepresentations, if he forged documents to secure leverage, that's multiple lanes, he said. If you're willing to gather other investors, we can move faster. I wasn't sure I had any more willing left, but the word he used after that, move, gave me spine. Eric tried to use charm like a password. He brought me a pale pink bag from Ikram, tissue paper like laughter, and said he'd booked us a weekend at the Langham to talk without lawyers. I imagined him rehearsing that line in the mirror, adjusting the angle of sincerity. I looked at the bag as if it were addressed to another woman. "I'll send it back," I said, and his face did the tiny collapse men's faces do when they run out of scripts. "Do what you want," he said. "You always do." My revenge never looked like a cinematic slap or a wine glass shattered on marble. But the night I invited them into my shop felt like the closest I came to a set. We told Grayson there was an investor reconciliation meet to satisfy a nervous family member, Leah's phrase. We told him to bring anyone who wanted reassurance. We told him Eric would present. He replied with a thumbs up, so lazy it made me want to break it. I set the space like a wake, the long table, folding chairs, the smell of eucalyptus and damp earth, low lamps and white hydrangeas cut tight so they wouldn't show off. I wore black because some things deserve it. Leah stood by the register with a man who looked like a barista, until you realized the square on his hip wasn't a phone. Rangel was there too, in plain clothes, sipping drip coffee like he was paid to. We had a stack of folders by each chair with a name label. Inside, the ledger pages Leah had duplicated from the box, the UCC filings tethering my house to his bravado, and a one-page timeline that ended with today's date. In the corner, the cooler hummed, a white noise machine for people who have stopped being naive. They came in waves, confident at first, and then cautious the nearer they got to the table. 2 men in cashmere, A woman in a pale suit with a handbag I could price from across the room. A compact man with a skull ring who nodded at my buckets like we spoke the same language. Grayson arrived last, irrepressible as mildew, and Eric drifted in behind him with shoulders back like he'd built the skyline and could rearrange it if anyone complained. He saw me and rearranged his jaw. "I didn't agree to this," he said, too low for the room, which meant loud enough. "You agreed to all sorts of things," I said. "Now you're going to answer questions." He reached for performance. "Investors," he said, turning, arms wide. "We're here because there's been—" "Sit," Leah said, and her voice had a municipal ring to it. He looked at the chairs like they'd betrayed him, and then sat because he hadn't learned how to disobey a tone like that. Grayson perched, as if perches could float. I stood at the end of the table, the woman with her name on the window, and told them how their money had traveled through mine. I told them about the box. I told them about the ledger, and pointed to the pen strokes Leah had circled, arrows labeled with the abbreviations of my accounts, a taxonomy of theft. I told them where the judge sat and what he'd signed. I told them about the gun we'd inventoried and the photos taken of a woman who'd agreed to love a man, but not to become his asset. Eric flinched only once, when I said my birthday out loud, the 6 numbers that had become a key. "The code," I said, looking at him because the room deserved to see it. "Wasn't clever. It was lazy." He tried to charm the table like he'd charmed me. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "Nora's been under a lot of pressure with the shop. She's got a lawyer who wants billables, and they're manufacturing—" "Manufacture this," said the woman with the pale suit, snapping her folder shut and tapping the ledger with one red nail. "You told me this tranche would be held separate from personal funds. If this money touched a marital account, you lied. If you forged a spouse's guarantee, you committed a crime." She turned to Rangel, who had been quiet so long the room had forgotten he was listening. "Is this when you say your name and show a badge, or do we wait for a schedule?" Rangel sipped his coffee like it might provide a drum roll. "My name is Investigator Rangel with the Illinois Securities Department," he said, not unkindly, pulling a leather wallet with a star out of his jacket so nobody needed to imagine it. "We are opening an investigation today. Mr. Whitman, you are not required to speak without counsel beyond confirming your identity. We advise you not to destroy any documents. We will be in touch with each of you to collect statements and records." Eric went still in a way that reminded me of a pond in December. Grayson found his phone and started scrolling, like the right emoji could reset reality. The skull ring man laughed once, low. "Told my sister," he said to no one. "Told her not to blend romance and returns." Eric stood abruptly, scraped the chair, turned toward me, like rage had given him a destination. "You did this," he said, pointing, as if a finger could reverse paperwork. "You couldn't stay in your lane." I felt my face go calm in the way faces get calm when they are done flinching. "My lane," I said, "has my name on it. That's what you hate." He lunged into words and tripped. The barista not barista stepped once to his left, and the path closed. He looked around for the altitude that had always saved him and found only people who could afford to look him in the eye. "I'm leaving," he said. "No," Leah said. "You're not. You're being served." She nodded to the man, who took 2 steps forward and placed a packet on the table, then another in front of Grayson, Then more down the line, the paper clap of a new chapter. Civil complaint, she said, for fraud, conversion, and breach, and notices of deposition. We'll see you at 50W Washington. She didn't have to add the room number. Some theaters sell out without a marquee. The next week braided itself into procedures. Eric's counsel, an expensive man with a haircut you pay a retainer to maintain, filed to quash, to delay, to demand. The judge who liked paper liked schedules more. We got deposition dates. We issued third-party subpoenas to banks with tall ceilings and lobby security that apologized while checking your bag. The assistant manager from State and Madison, Rita, came in a gray suit that still smelled like copier ink and testified, steady and almost regretful, about our morning in the vault. The notary who'd allegedly witnessed my signature on the guarantee sat in a chair under a fluorescent light and blinked when Leah placed my driver's license in front of him, then the guarantee, then a blown-up image of that hesitation in the R of my name. "Can you explain the tremor here?" she asked sweetly. He couldn't, because it wasn't mine. Grayson cracked first. Men like him always do when rooms lose the accessories they're comfortable with. In deposition, he tried smirking at the court reporter until she looked over her glasses and made him feel like detention. Leah slid a page across that we'd pulled from his own email. We'll paper the guarantor, problem solved, and watched him read it, like a man seeing his first word. "Did you write this?" she asked. He tried to remember all the words for no and landed on "I don't recall," which made the court reporter's fingers move with the speed of a lesson. "We have metadata," Leah said. The haircut lawyer shifted. Grayson shifted more. "Fine," he said. "Yes, but that's just slang." "Slang," Leah said, "for forgery." The state's attorney's office liked their lanes neat. We carried boxes up to 69W Washington until my shoulders sang. We sat with an assistant state's attorney who had the patient eyes of someone who has seen every new scam wear an old suit. She asked for more. We gave more. She asked for the ledger. We gave the ledger. She asked if I wanted to be a witness. I said I wanted my name back. "That's a yes," she said kindly, and I realized that was what it sounded like when a stranger believed you. Not because you were charming, not because you tilted, but because the math worked. The day the court froze the safe deposit cash, pending the outcome of the civil case and potential criminal charges, I stood on the marble outside the Daily Center and watched men with briefcases walk like their shoes were new. Eric stood across the plaza, pretending to be on the phone. When he looked up, the fear sat openly on his face, like a stain that wouldn't lift. He walked toward me and stopped when he saw Leia at my left and Rangel at my right, as if I'd assembled bodyguards for my better choices. "You think you won," he said, raw. "I think," I said, "you taught me how to." When the hammer finally fell, it didn't sound like a hammer. It sounded like a clerk saying, "All rise!" and the judge's voice making a checklist of numbers. It sounded like the assistant state's attorney reading a count sheet: forgery, financial institution fraud, theft by deception. And the defense counsel, asking for time like time, would say yes. It sounded like Rita's careful voice, saying she'd watched a woman open a drawer with a code that matched her date of birth. Like the notary failing to recall witnessing anything. Like Grayson's attempt at cleverness collapsing under the weight of a transcript. It sounded, eventually, like custody. because the gun in the box had no paperwork and the serial number traced to a man in Indiana who had a very low tolerance for strangers, telling police they'd never met him. Bondsmen don't take bravado as collateral. Eric went home that night to a place that wasn't our house because my locks didn't know him anymore. Later, he didn't go home at all. People think revenge tastes like sugar. It doesn't. It tastes like metal, like I'd been carrying a key under my tongue for months and finally spit it out. The civil case crawled the way justice crawls when it wants to be careful. I sat for my deposition and told the truth until it had edges. Leah smiled when it was over and sent a quiet signal to the court reporter, who handed me a peppermint like a communion I could accept. Investors filed their own claims, some angry, some embarrassed, some relieved to have an enemy they could point to and say, "That one." The state proceeded at the pace of a machine that had learned its mistakes. The schedule knitted months together. In the meantime, small mercies arrived in envelopes. A letter from my mortgage company confirming that the routine inquiry had been closed and that no changes would be made without me in the room. A notice from the court stating the house was not to be encumbered, absent my consent. A formal revocation of Soho House membership, delivered with the cruelty of a club pretending to be polite. One afternoon in late fall, after the leaves in Lincoln Square had made the sidewalks look like expensive wrapping paper, I drove to the Chase on Lawrence and opened a safe deposit box in my own name. I brought a small tin that had once held butter cookies and now held my favorite photographs, my children with cheeks the size of their fists, my mother in a dress with polka dots like raindrops, my own hands buried in peonies the week before a June wedding that smelled like the entire city had decided to be gentle. I brought the yellow Post-it he had written with my 6 numbers and stuck it to the back page of the craft notebook we'd taken from him, which I kept not because I needed it, but because it reminded me of the most important line I'd ever drawn. I didn't put money in the box. I put my will. I put a letter to myself on stationery from the shop, telling the woman who would open the box again that she survived because she learned rudeness can be a virtue when men are counting on your courtesy. I put a copy of the court's order with a sticky note that read, "You did this." When the civil settlement came, because most do in the end, it arrived with none of the flourish he used to trade in. It arrived by email, a PDF with numbers neat and finally true. He would disgorge funds, he would release claims, he would sign public apologies that avoided the word sorry, but not the words wrong and unlawful. The state's charges would sit for longer, the way heavy things do. Sentences have their own weather. I didn't control that. What I controlled was the quiet accounting I kept for myself. The shop balance sheets that no longer bore anyone else's shadow. The mortgage that had been a threat and became again only a payment I could make. The slow way my bed learned my shape again. Grayson sent a letter through his lawyer asking for leniency as a cooperating participant. I didn't answer. It wasn't addressed to me. He'd shave years off his pretense by stepping hard on the neck of the man who'd taught him where to stand. Men who hate gravity always forget they share it. On a gray morning with a wind off the lake that made older bones announce themselves, I walked into the Palmer House lobby because I wanted to see the ceiling again. The clerk looked at me like all clerks do when a woman in a good coat appears at a desk without luggage. "Can I help you?" he asked. "You already did," I said, and he smiled in the way people smile when they've been given a compliment they can't quite place. I crossed to the mirrors and looked at the woman who had once been told she'd never be rich. I thought about the men who need to say that to keep their own accounts balanced. I thought about the hook of my name on the window of my shop and the fact that every day I unlocked the door, I was richer than any of them ever understood. At home that night, I opened a bottle of Pinot and cut a pear into thin slices and watched the snow try its first rehearsal of the season. I turned off my phone and let the house be quiet enough for my heartbeat to be the loudest thing. People think revenge ends with applause. Mine ended with inventory. I went into the back room and opened the cardboard archive box where I kept the case papers, and I took out the ledger one last time. I ran my finger along an arrow he had drawn from my IRA to a shell, to his pocket, and then to cash. I closed my eyes and saw the bank vault again, the wheel turning, the hush, the slow lift of the lid. The code he'd never bothered to hold as anything but a tool sat on my tongue like a prayer that had decided to be a lockpick. I pictured his face when I said those 6 numbers out loud in my shop, and I felt nothing at all, which was the point. I put the ledger away. I put my hands on the table and waited to feel poor or triumphant or vindicated. I felt none of those words. I felt older, which I had earned, and unafraid, which I had built. Outside, a plow whispered down the block like a promise. Inside, the heat clanked, and somewhere in the city, a steel door sighed open because someone had told it the right truth about who they were. Later, in bed, with the lights off and the house solid around me, I whispered my birthday, as if there were a god of doors who could hear it. The sound of the numbers in the dark felt like a new year when the fireworks have burned down and the city is shivering in the quiet that follows. A breath, even after all that noise. And that night, I learned wealth has a sound after all. It is the click a lock makes when it finally remembers who it belongs to. The end